Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Google Hangout for the Human MOOC. Tonight, I would like to welcome Patrick Lowenthal. He's an assistant professor of educational technology at Boise State University, where apparently they have a lot more snow than we do here in Ithaca, New York. And his primary areas of research are in social presence, instructor social presence, and teaching presence. So we're really excited to have him participate in the Hangout tonight, since those are the three areas that our MOOC focuses on. So right now I will turn it over to Patrick, and please feel free to either post your questions in the chat box or on Twitter. I'll be monitoring both and letting him know when there's some questions. Thanks a lot, Patrick.
Okay, great. So I'm happy to be here, everyone. So my name is Patrick Lowenthal. You can see my Twitter handle is P Lowenthal. I just spent the day skiing with my kid, so I literally just got in, and I'm looking forward to having a quick, kind of almost speed dating 30 minutes with you guys. This is something that's really hard to delve into too deeply, and especially something that I love and care about. With that said, I mean, I've given similar kind of talks in different, I guess, links, and so I've tried to mesh some different slides that I have together to kind of make a good 30-minute presentation. We'll see how this goes. But with that, post questions, and we'll get there. For me, I think it's important to start with a little bit about who I am. See. All right, and so I'm in Boise, Idaho, and so I work at Boise State University. I'm in the Department of Educational Technology. She's kind of gave you this typical bio, but I think of myself because it really just goes back to my career path, but as an educator, but also as a researcher. And so you'll see this kind of this tension or you might sense it, between kind of researching social presence and practicing it. I also spent years as an instructional designer and as kind of an instructional developer as well as faculty developer. So I don't see myself just as a researcher or just as a practitioner who just teaches online, though. I've been teaching online since 2003. And that's how I got into social presence. When I started teaching online and when I got into social presence, I didn't care about students. All I cared about was myself. I was really, and I think a lot of teachers do this, but we don't really want to admit it, or we don't necessarily acknowledge it. But it's all I wanted to know is, I do all of this stuff, right, when I teach online, or when I teach face-to-face, sorry. My energy, my passion, all these things, and I didn't know how that was going to translate to when I teach online. I was like, well, are they going to get even an inkling of who I am? So it was sadly not so much about who they are. And my research and my interests have definitely evolved over time. But I want to say that I think that a lot of times when faculty are new to teaching online, they don't know how they're into things, right? That transaction, that educational experience that they see them being in charge of one part of it, they don't know how they're going to do that online because the feeling, everything about it. And so that's how I got into social presence. It really wasn't about the students, it was about me. And so I kind of argue at times it's more about instructor social presence that got me interested in this. But with that, I'm going to jump in. I'm going to talk a little about the history of social presence. And I'm doing that because I think this is my own little soapbox, and I have like 30 slides for 30 minutes, so this is going to be fast, this front matter. But I think that so often we get caught up in the community of inquiry framework, and we see that as just where social presence began. And someone who loves social presence research and everything it means to be, socially present, if you will, and even that we could take apart, the researcher in me, I think it's important to understand where it came from. So social presence theory started in the 70s. There was, in England, they were doing a lot of research on social presence theory with telecommunication. So there was College of London, Short, Williams, Christie, a bunch of other people. They were doing stuff, and they were really interested in social presence and really how telecommunications. And at that time, it was a lot of what was conference calling and things like that were changing kind of the work dynamic, and people were interested in, well, what does this mean? And so they did a lot of individual kind of studies and white papers. But their big book came out in the I think 76, and they defined social presence as the degree of salience, that quality or state of being there and being real between two communicators using a communication medium. So they weren't thinking about online learning, and so for me, my kind of lens with social presence starts not with community of inquiry, not with online learning, but with kind of communication theory, if you will, and how technology plays into that. So the gist of what they thought, and they really had more of a technological determinist kind of view of this, but they saw that like technology influences, or the communication medium influences, the amount of social presence, what we can do. And so they saw things like text as, being very little social presence, whereas face-to-face or video as having a lot of social presence. And this was really kind of the thinking at the time, and during the 80s, this kind of got pushed a little more as email became to be more popular. But at that time, they weren't thinking about email per se, right? They were really focused on like video, the telephone, the written word, that kind of thing, And as the research has evolved, people really have pushed back and saying it's not just about the communication media. Because you can think of the love letter that has a ton of presence, right? Versus you can also imagine places where you might have been face to face, and this image is so pixelated, it's funny. I want to fix it right now. Says something about me. But this idea when we're face to face sometimes, and you don't even feel like the person's even listening to you, right? And so it's more than that, and that's kind of how it's evolved. But back then, is really focused on one-to-one communication. And you can even think about online courses nowadays, and it's not really about one-to-one per se, right? And so during the 80s, as email basically increased, and computer-mediated communication, other researchers developed really similar theories. The cuelessness theory, and the media richness theory, both were kind of this idea that email, if you will, as a shorthand, lacks certain cues, and so we think about these body cues, these things that we do when we communicate, and that they lack it, so therefore they are inherently impersonal and antisocial, right? But over time, this idea of social presence started to evolve, and I really believe the evolution really started when, during the 1990s, we started doing more with online learning, and educators started to argue, wait, social presence can be very personal. So you can kind of see this timeline, this evolution from the 70s, where Short and colleagues, developed the social presence theory. Other communication researchers really focusing more on business, the cuelessness, media richness, and then even social information processing, a very communication perspective. But then Gunnar and then Garrison, kind of you see this evolution, and part of me would say we're even at probably another stage of social presence research now, but we'll go. Oh, I forget my slides. And so I really see us as kind of this phase 4, where it's taking the predominant theory now is this community of inquiry, or sometimes I think, Garrison even talks about in his new book, is almost thinking of as community of questioning. Sometimes inquiry might be a dense word, but questioning always makes sense, right? And so this different aspect of it, and well, what does a community of inquiry look like, and how do we do this in online courses? And that's kind of this 4th phase that we find ourselves in. And so, and we're really at this point trying to just push this forward and collect data on how does this really help with learning it? How do we do it? Because the community of inquiry posits that there's these 3 presences that come together to contribute to a educational experience, but it's not always clear on, well, how do I use social presence to help, or how do I use teaching presence strategies, if you will, instructional design, facilitation, etc., to help develop social presence and cognitive presence? And when do I do it? How long do I do it? I mean, what strategies? I mean, I think sometimes we too confidently talk about like we figured all this out, and the researcher in me says, not sure we have. Originally, the idea was that from Garrison and his colleagues is that social presence has an affective component, a cohesive component, and an interactive component. And they identified some initial ways that you can identify this in discussions, but obviously now with the media we have, there's a lot more to this. For one, we're focused on more the many to many. It's no longer just one to one. And I still would say that the instructor, I almost said, should have another slide where the instructors, we got some sound in the background, where the instructor is almost a different color. I almost should have a slide. One of these people should be yellow or orange or whatever, right? To say that as much as the community of inquiry envisions us flattening this structure, I've argued elsewhere that there is something still unique about the instructor's role, and I'll come back to that. But with this kind of, with social presence, I do think that there's varied understandings, and I'm gonna just make a few quick points, and then I'm gonna get into, all right, well, how do we do this, or how do I think we do this, and what's some of the research I've collected. So some of the varied understandings, I think that some people see social presence as being emotional, very emotional. It's something like they almost see it as like virtual hugs. But if you think of back their original theory, and it's evolved, of course, and even if you look at Garrison's work, his definitions of social presence have changed, and I'm doing some work on that for another paper. But there's this idea that, and I argue that some definitions of social presence focus on an emotional aspect. That notion of being there isn't just being there, being present, but being there in a supportive way, right? But there are some definitions that, no, it doesn't have to be supportive at all, where you can almost imagine that drill instructor that's there, wants you to succeed, but there's really no virtual hugs there. They're in your face, kind of pushing you, challenging you. Some definitions focus on connection, right? Where you're connected, you're feeling a belongingness per se, and but others don't focus on this connection. It's just a matter that we're there, we're real, we feel like we're there, supportive for the goals of the course. We don't necessarily have to feel a connection. And then some even push to this idea of community, and sometimes I think that people get confused, or I argue that there's a lack of clarity in the literature, that sometimes people see social presence as equal to learning community. Now, I don't see it that way, and so I wanted to kind of make that case, because when I'm working with faculty and I want to build community, one, I believe that community is very hard, and I don't think we accomplish it in most courses. Despite that we like to label every course as a learning community, I believe that most courses aren't don't have a true sense of community, or some people push that beyond the metaphor and say are a community. So when I'm working with faculty, I really let's focus first on interaction. All right, how do we get that student to student, student to teacher, and student to content interaction? And then hopefully by doing that, you can, through strategies, through instructional design, through facilitation, through direct instruction, you can develop social presence. And some of those strategies can actually get students collaborating. But to me, social presence does not equal collaboration, as well as collaboration doesn't equal community. Hopefully, if we do this right, we can eventually get to community. But this is hard work, and I think sometimes we don't acknowledge that. We don't recognize that this is hard, and this takes time, and it takes intentional effort. So here are a number of different strategies I'm going to go through. Some bio strategies, orientation, reconnecting, feedback, discussion, small group, and organic interaction. And then I'm going to touch on some recent research, and recent for the last 18 months, so it's kind of recent, that I'm doing. But what I do want to say is that one of my beliefs with social presence, and this is probably a little different than Garrison and some of the community of inquiry research, is some of it talks about, well, we just need to focus on social presence in the beginning, and then once we kind of, everything's great, we feel a trusting environment, everything just works. Joni Dunlap and I have specifically argued that, no, we think that you need to come back throughout a semester and try to do some other reconnecting strategies, and that this isn't just, a nice icebreaker and you're done. So with that, one of the first two things that we do is we focus on bios, both teacher bios, and I'll jump here to student bios, and I'm going to come back. But on each one of these slides, I try to have something in the bottom that says, all right, here's some more information, and I kind of give a title of something related that I've written, Joni and I, that's who I've done most of my work with. And so if you're interested, for instance, in digital stories, well, we've written something about it, or scholarship philosophy, you name it. So if you Google that stuff, most of it's on my website. These slides are on my website at patricklowenthal.com. But let's start with teacher bios. I believe the teacher has a unique relationship. As much as we want to flatten it and have a learner-centered environment, the teacher's there, and there's a reason why students are taking this course rather than just doing a Khan Academy video. And not to suggest I want to say that like credits aren't important and there's other reasons, but I think the teacher, I always want see as a huge part of online courses. And there are definitely ways that the teacher doesn't have to be at the center, but I think that the teacher or teachers or mentors, there's lots of ways you can think of that, course leaders, which they can be students, but I think often, especially when grades are assigned at the end, I think the teacher holds a unique role, and that we need to acknowledge that, and students want to get to know the teacher better. We look at Chickering Amson's literature back in the day, we can see that that relationship with the teacher is important. And so a lot of the things that we think about, Joni and I, when we talk about, well, let's do bios, well, if it's important as students do it, instructors should do it as well. So digital stories is one way. So I did, with the Center of Digital Storytelling, I did a digital story on basically how I got into teaching a few years ago, and it's called Samsara, and it's on YouTube, but it basically tells my story in a certain way. And I've had some unique experiences sharing that with students versus the typical text bio. But the other thing that we talk about is like this, our philosophy of teaching or our scholarship. So often there are things that, especially for faculty, if you're in a tenure line and so much of what you do is research and scholarship, well, you should share that stuff with students. This is something that defines you. Sometimes the courses I teach don't always, relate to what I research, and so I think it's important to kind of share the things that you care about, both professionally and personally. So sometimes I also tell people, I share my interest in music. I will talk about my interest in craft beer. I mean, you name it, right? It's this idea of how do you get a sense of that notion of social presence. I believe it's this idea that you're real, but not just that you like have a heartbeat, right? But it's that you get to know their personality, their persona, and these other aspects. But I think it's important also to do this with student bios. And so, and what I probably should say, we also have a chapter where we go into some of these strategies differently. I think it's called Power of Presence. And I don't think I actually have that as one of these more infos. But like Joni Dunlap will use VoiceThread for, what's one of your superhero powers as an icebreaker initially. I've also done where students have to create a digital story themselves, whether it's something in Animoto, you name it, right? There's lots of great tools now. What's that, Adobe Voice? I'm trying to think of some of the iPad ones. But lots of ways where students can share something and in some ways create a bio that can even be used throughout the semester, or I mean throughout their program of study. And so I tend to teach graduate students, master's, and doctoral level online, but I think some of these are equally powerful for non-credit courses or for undergrad. So other things with student bios is Joni Dunlap does this a lot, and we've written a paper, I'm surprised we don't mention it there. There it is, the defeating the Kobayashi. So this is a slide that was meant to be deleted. But one of the things she does is the 5-minute phone call. So she puts out an invitation. You can, like on Google Calendar, set up these times and students can sign up for one, but to do a 5-minute phone call. And so the goal is just to make each other laugh by the end of the 5 minutes. And what it does is when you start with that invitation that, yeah, it's okay to call me. I mean, I started teaching online in early 2000s, and I would always give my phone number. And students sometimes would struggle, and later on in the semester I'd reach out and be like, why didn't you call me? And they were like, well, I felt like it was an online course. I shouldn't do that. I should just use email. And so sometimes just that phone call can, eliminate all kinds of problems. And I've definitely found this is if a student starts a flaming incident happens, things get out of hand, a quick phone call can take care of so much. And the power of the voice and just setting up that relationship that, yeah, we can talk. We can do this. The phone is okay. These low-tech solutions are okay. Other things I do is kind of this photo roster where in Google Docs I have them create this photo bio. And, there's definitely Canvas and some other LMSs give you that Facebook picture thing. But what I do is I create this in Google Docs that then I can even print out, and I encourage students to do it, and I put it next to my desk. I should actually take a picture of it. But what I can do is when I'm working a course and I'm grading someone's work, I can glance up and I can look at their face. I can get a reminder of what they do for a living. Because someone, like, I'm horrible with names. And so this is something that really helps me, is the photo roster. And so it's one of these things where I might do this as part 2 of a bio activity in the first week. They have to introduce themselves to students, but also complete this bio. The other thing that I do is, or that I think is important, is orienting students to not just the course, right? Here's the syllabus, blah, blah, blah. But each week there are ways to do this. And I've created orientation videos and done this. I've also done it without videos, and I'm going to later talk about some of my video research. But Joni will do these things where she'll create detailed announcements, even talk about like what she did this weekend. She'll have some pictures and do some of it with emails. And so one of the things that I'll do with emails is I will sometimes use we use PeopleSoft. I can send out an email without a hi Bob or hi class. I can even do a hey, hope you, and it feels like for students that I'm sending them a personal email that then they sometimes often reply, and we can have some of that one-on-one communication, which some of my other research has shown that that's really what students value the most, is that one-on-one. They don't want that group-to-group or this large class stuff. They want to feel like they're getting, private time, if you will, individual time with the instructor. So
Patrick, can I interrupt you with 2 questions?
Of course.
One is from Rick Bartlett, and he asked, Joseph Myers talks about 4 arenas of space: community, social, personal, intimate. How does this material intersect with building connections with students in the social and personal spheres?
I've not looked at those 4 spheres as far as he talks about it, but there's community. I could just go off on community forever, so I'm going to try not to do that, because some of my current research right now is critiquing how we talk about community and looking at educational research. And I'm influenced highly by Brent Wilson's work and colleagues on bounded community, because I think that we use community often when we don't really mean community. But that's a side thing. But there is these interfaces of personal and intimate and all of this. Social presence, when you look at Garrison's work, they talk about like the affective component, really talks about like self-disclosure, right? And you get in this idea that through these one-on-ones, it is this kind of intimate. Now, but with students, so intimacy can go too far. But if you go back to Short and Williams' research, they talk about building on 2 earlier themes of research in communication and psychology, is intimacy and immediacy. And so they definitely see originally this kind of starting with this idea of intimacy, and this really goes back to this one-on-one. But when you think about intimacy, how do you do intimacy many to many? And this goes back to why I think it's much easier to be intimate on smaller scale, smaller groups. And this is where some of my research has been on social presence. It's a lot easier to do some of this in smaller groups than many. And so when you think on scale, it gets harder. I still don't believe it's impossible, but it definitely gets harder. And so I don't know if I really kind of addressed that question or not. Was there another one? And we can go back to that at the end if I didn't really capture that.
Oh yeah, there's another question from Maha. What's the difference between social presence, collaboration, and community?
Great. I see social presence as this being there and being real. Collaboration is actually interacting and working together on something, and I see collaboration and cooperation is different. And so if you look at the cooperation learning literature and collaboration literature, it's different. Because you can get a sense that I'm there and I'm real, but we don't have to work on things together. And so you think about an instructor and a student building social presence together. They're not collaborating per se. I mean, you could argue, yes, they both, learning doesn't happen just in the head. It's a social construction, right? But often when we're talking about collaboration, we're talking about students to students collaborating, connecting, and you could even take the instructor and say, well, the instructor's not a central figure, but another learner in this collaborative thing. But I think that when we look at this, right, or if we take social presence out of a classroom, and you say you emailed the registrar or you emailed your advisor, right? Social presence exists as a theory, as this way of a communication theory outside of the classroom. And I believe that you can have social presence without collaboration. I don't think you can have collaboration without some degree of social presence. So then community, I think, is when you get this, where students start to feel the sense of belonging that's a little better. I think people can collaborate, students can collaborate on, let's say, a group project, and they don't necessarily have to feel the sense of belongingness and trust. And if you look at some of the communication literature, especially in the learning sciences, when you think about all these ways of jointly connecting knowledge, et cetera, or communities of practice, and even that literature, right? You can think about being a periphery or being in the center. I definitely see collaboration. I can collaborate on something with some parents at my daughter's school, right, without ever feeling a true sense of community. And then if you push that true sense isn't the same as a true community that I self-identify with, and identity's wrapped up in that. And so I think that so that's kind of, and I could push this more, and this is a paper I'm working on, because I think that I think the literature's messy on this, and so I'm trying to make my argument of how I think social presence is different than collaboration, which is different than community. I hope that kind of helps. All right, so I'm going to move on. I got like 4 minutes, so we'll see how I'm doing. Reconnecting strategy. So I think that throughout the semester we got to come back to this kind of, let's take some social time, because I think that learning is a social experience, and I think that we do have to reconnect, and I do think that there's times it's important to do social things that aren't necessarily always perfectly aligned with the learning objectives. And I'm doing another paper on my anti-learning objectives rant, but that's a whole other story for another day. But two of the things that or one of the bigger things that Joni and I have talked about is using digital music. And so we did a paper where we collected some data on how do you use like Spotify or Pandora, these virtual jukebox, to kind of share things. So she'll do a soundtrack of your life, pick a song from your past, one from your current, present, and one from the future. And I've done things where someone has to pick a song that really has and then share a story with it. And so, and it's amazing what you learn when you're like, wow, so-and-so likes gangster rap, but Julie loves two-stepping, or you name it, right? You get to know people a little better. And so we talk about social presence, this idea of being real. That's an idea where you start to learn someone's persona, or who they are, that story of themselves, a lot better as time goes on. Other things that some of the research Joni and I have done has clearly said that feedback is one of the best ways to establish presence with students when you think of that teacher-student relationship. So one way I've done that is video feedback, and so I've collected some research or some data, I guess, and I have a few different papers in progress on this. But this idea of video feedback, I fire up Jing, 5 minutes, give feedback. It saves, when I started doing it, once again, it wasn't about students. It was about me, selfishly. I wanted to save time. I had to give feedback like on websites. And if you've ever like tried to add a comment to an Excel spreadsheet, it's really tough, right, to give that feedback. And I found 5 minutes in Jing, and I use Jing because I love in 5 minutes it tells me to shut up. We're done. The bread and butter that most people use to establish social presence is they do it in asynchronous discussions. And Joni's written some stuff on protocols for online discussions, but what I've been doing more and more is some synchronous discussions, live meetings, and I call them happy hours, and I could talk more about that, collecting data on that. But this idea of like 3, 4, maybe 5 times a semester at strategic times, doing live happy hour sessions where people come together synchronously. I don't require them, but they can earn points. Some of our research has also talked about the importance of just small groups. It's a lot easier to build trust and the interaction. If you think about the 3 elements of the community of inquiry's social presence definition, it's a lot easier to do that in smaller groups than large groups. In our experience, and we've collected some data that suggests that's so. Other organic ways, and we use this probably less per se. We used to intentionally use Twitter, for instance, to establish presence. We've collected some data. Students were all over the board. Some loved it, some didn't. And you can read about that. Tweeting the night away. There's also Horton Here's a Tweet. We wrote about some of that. We really should do a follow-up because we collected some data and we've never written on that. But I think that social media, and it's different for each group. Sometimes it's Facebook. Sometimes it's Twitter. They all each have some great stuff. It's really kind of finding where are your learners at. Like library students we found were always on Facebook. Others are on Twitter. List goes on, but it can that you can capture that out of classroom hallway talk, chit chatter in ways, as well as help them connect with professionals and the larger community of practice, which is the ultimate goal, I think. So I'm going to say, like, I think I have two more slides. So instructor social presence, I think, is different than social presence and is different than teaching presence. It says, how does the instructor establish him or herself as their unique position as being real and being there? And so I've been doing some things on recording videos throughout campus because my students are not on my campus, and helping them get a sense of that they belong to this larger, education environment, and that Boise, that we're not just this kind of blip on a screen. We're something more, with people and buildings and all of these things. And obviously this might work better for some schools than others, but for us, when we only have less than 15% of our students are located in Idaho, it's great when I can walk them through the quad and in 3 minutes show them something. And so I fire up my phone and I go. Other research that I'm doing right now, and I've collected about the last year and a half, it's about video. We're really obsessed with video. We think video for social presence is the answer. And this is an example where I was doing something and I went and looked on YouTube and I saw that this video had only 5 views. The 6th was my own. And I'm like, 5 people have watched this? Why am I doing video announcements? And so I've done a lot of research since on what are different ways to use video versus video announcements, versus video feedback, versus synchronous video, versus instructional screencasts. I've also done other research on what's the power of having the talking head there versus having a picture versus no. And so I've done a lot of that stuff. I love this stuff. I hope this gives you at least ideas of what are ways that you might establish presence, social presence, specifically at the beginning of your course, but what are ways that you might do it throughout your course and after your course, right? So back to social media, when you can still connect with some of these students after the semester is over. Very powerful stuff. So with that, I'll take a minute or two if we have it for questions. If not, we can wrap it up.
All right, thank you, Patrick. I don't see any other questions in the question area here, and Maha said that you did answer her question, and she just had a little bit of a follow-up that said, so can we say collaboration is externally driven while community is more internally driven?
Oh, wow. I don't know if I would simplify. I don't know. I mean, the reason, and I'm reacting more to the collaboration in my mind, because I think there are times where, like in my classes, sometimes there's assignments you can do on your own, or you can do in a group, and it's up to you. And so some of the times that might be internally driven, where you're like, well, I want to work with so-and-so. And so I think that collaboration doesn't have to be an external versus external. But I do think it's an interesting thing with community, because that's my issue with, so Brent Wilson and them talk about bounded community, and the problem with classes is, especially when we have now 5-week and 7-week classes, right, is that you don't get to choose your course mates. You don't always get to choose your instructor, and you don't get to choose how you interact with. So it's this kind of bounded, kind of false. So the question is, how do you kind of design for community? Community is a mushy word, right? It's not quite. I've been in my mind wondering, how's it like love, right? Love is this word that it's really hard to define, but we feel like you know it when you feel it. And so how would you design for love or attraction, right? It's community. We try to design for this. And it happens sometimes in all kinds of ways, but often I find it happens much more organically outside of the classroom, in various ways. And I think that when it does, it is internally driven. The question is, can you design community somehow externally? I don't know. I mean, in some ways, I think you can. But that's the rub, right? And so I keep going back in my mind. So we idealize community, right? And we don't think about communities that are bad or negative, or we don't think about the people in a community that still feel a part of, but they're disruptive. And so I think that we idealize this kind of and romanticize this idea of what community is. But I sit there and I go back in my mind. I'm like, well, KKK, they were. That's a community. The Nazis were a community, right? Or I sit there and I think about other situations where, I imagine law school, right? And I never went to law school, but I imagine these classes where students are being beat down, but They do this sometimes, it's externally influenced, right? But there's also that internal motivation. So, typically if you ever said is it external versus, if you ever give me a binary, I'm probably always going to say it's somewhere in between, right? It's never external, it's never internal, it's a little bit of both. And I realize that's kind of a cop-out, but usually I find that it's never simple as black and white or external versus internal. I don't know.
Okay, and if you have time, we have one more question.
Yep.
This is from Margaret. Based on your research, how important is live video feed of instructor head versus a still?
So what I'll say is I've only collected a little bit of research with this. So for years I've done instructional screencast, but I only show my computer, and so I'm like showing them how to use Dreamweaver. And I've a lot of student feedback on that. But I then did a follow-up study last spring where I had two conditions. I wanted a third. I didn't have enough enrollments. Long story, won't bore you. But in that semester I did half of the or one section, 1.5 sections technically, and another 1.5 sections. I did one with a still shot of myself, and another one with the talking head. Now, I want to say that, and I collected some data and haven't analyzed on, I do think there might be a difference from pure lecturing with PowerPoints versus I'm showing you how to use Dreamweaver, but in my research, students valued more the live the live video feed of me in the top right corner. And I've not gone enough to compare that data to the previous semesters where there was no picture and no video at all. And so it's just really preliminary data. I'm more of a scholarship of teaching and learning, like a small level kind of. I like to stir things up, collect a little data, and then people like to do bigger studies, go for it, right? But I expected there to be no significant difference, and there was. So students in this sample, right, it's just one study. Too often we get a little research and we say, research proves. No, 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 no. This is just one study that suggests, in this sample with this context, students preferred seeing this little picture of myself talking in the corner. I think a lot more research needs to be done on this. And really where this came from, I was in Europe at a conference, and someone came up to me, and I'm talking about my other research and video. And they said, all I want to know is should I have a video of picture-in-picture, like should I have a video of myself or not for social presence? I'm like, I don't know. The research hasn't really been done. I mean, you can look at Mayer's work, and we could talk about cognitive load, and that's where you find this tension, right, between learning versus presence, social presence, I should clarify, and even social presence. A lot of the research has shown that there isn't at least something we've proved to show there's a direct relationship to learning. We have seen a relationship to perceived learning, seen a relationship to satisfaction, and we can find other research that says satisfaction is related to learning, but it's messy. And so I don't want you to run away and say we all need picture-in-picture video of ourselves, but to say that in the little research I've done so far, students preferred the live video feed in the top corner, which shocked me, I should say. I didn't think they'd care or even notice it. And there were a few students who didn't notice, I should say that. All right, I lost audio.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much for your time tonight. We really appreciate you joining the Human MOOC Hangout. And hopefully you'll be able to go out and enjoy a lot of skiing over the holiday break.
I hope so. You guys be good. Your contact information, you can find me. You can find me online. My slides are at patricklowenthal.com. If you have other questions, follow up. If you want to research on this stuff with me, follow up. I love social presence. Have fun, guys. Be good.
All right. Bye. Thank you.